Good morning, friends. Welcome you all for Neuro Equilibrium Society webinar on role of clinical examination in vertigo. So we had this program 3 days back on 5th of June. I heard a profound statement by the speaker, who is none other than the person who is going to speak today, Dr. Avinash Bijlani. When do the examination of a patient starts? He made a very, very profound statement. That is, the moment patient enters your chamber or even now your outpatient department, that is when it starts. I think this is something, some message each and every one of us remember, take it with us as a take home message, one of the profound statement. Because I remember way back in 92 to 95 when I was in PJ Chandigarh as a resident. Some of my consultants, the moment I take a patient with them, we were supposed to discuss after examining patients. When we take the patients inside, looking at the patient's face or hearing the voice, the way patient is entering into the chamber, they used to tell the diagnosis: is this allergic rhinitis patient? Okay, is this BPPV patient? Okay, is this otosclerosis patient? I used to wonder how they can make out even before examining or before I present the case. That is because if you're a good clinician, you will be able to pick up those points. See what happened day first day when Dr. Avinash sir he presented his presentation. Because of the shortage of time, he had to hurry up with the clinical examination. Many participants they requested me, can we repeat that? That is the exact reason I requested him to repeat this, and NES was very happy. More than that, he has a very big heart. Immediately agreed, why not? Let me do it, and let me come with some more cases, some more interesting videos if available. He volunteered. I thank him very much. Why clinical examination vertigo? Friends, see, clinical examination is a trade of our tools. Okay, see, you look at a carpenter, what does he carry? He carries some tools. Okay, you look at a blacksmith, or you look at an engineer, an architecture, he carries a trade like the draft machine or something like that. Similarly, our tools of trade are our clinical examination, and our each and every one of us should be very, very much adept with this clinical examination. That is the exact reason I requested Avinash sir to repeat it. Sir, welcome. Before that, I'm going to some instructions to all the participants. I have an humble request to all the participants to enhance audio visual quality. Please mute your audio, okay, and turn off your camera. Otherwise, this Zoom setup is going to use a lot of bandwidth, and the quality is not going to be very good. And also, kindly avoid public chat in the chat area, and also please avoid parallel discussion to prevent distraction of distraction to the other participants. If you have a query, I'm going to moderate that. You put a query to me either as a personal message or in a public chat. We will take up that end of the session. Okay, unless it is very important, I'm not going to stop the speaker in between. Very important, because I have to let him do what he's doing. I have to give him his flow. Okay, that is important. And also kindly direct all your academic questions to the moderator, that is me today. And we have three fantastic panelists. Okay, one of the senior man from Aurangabad, Dr. Ramesh Rohiwal. He brings with him a lot of experience in vertigo. He has a dedicated vertigo practice. And we have our secretary from one of the premier institute of India from SGPJ Lucknow, Dr. Amit Keshri, and also a very young man from Bangalore, Dr. Rajendran Dinesh Kumar. But believe me, very, very, very highly accomplished academic person, even though very young, at very young age. So I welcome all also for this event. With this, I request Dr. Avinash sir to share his screen. I think he is co-host anyway already. So you can share
your screen. I'm going to do it right away, sir. First of all, a very good morning to all the participants. Thank you, Dr. Prahlada, for such kind words. I don't know. I mean, I was really overwhelmed to hear that the last talk was appreciated. So I try to improvise on that this time also. Yeah. So. So friends, as in any field of medicine, a good history and a good physical examination is very important. But when it comes to a patient of vertigo, it becomes the cardinal feature, the way you go about treating your patient ultimately. And for vertigo, I would say that almost 2/3 of your diagnosis is made by the time you've taken a history. The rest 1/3 is made if you've done a good physical examination. And if anybody is trying to look at fancy testing methods and looking all the time for obscure or uncommon disorders, I say God help you.
This is
Please.
Amit this side. There is a request from members today that please explain each point in a little detail.
Yeah, I know, Amit. Yeah, I will be doing that. Yeah.
And you have 1 hour time. You can.
I'll be doing that. Yeah, I'll be doing that. We'll go a little slow. So God help you if you don't follow the basics if you're treating a patient of vertigo. That's what I would like to say. Let's stick to the basics that have been taught to us from almost over a century now. So with this, I will begin my talk. Well, I'll just begin with a bit of basics, of which probably most likely all of us are aware. So the message is supposed to go from the peripheral vestibular labyrinth to the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem through the first order neurons via the vestibular nerve, and the second order neurons via the medial longitudinal fasciculus take it to the ocular motor nuclei of the fourth nerve, from where on the process begins to supply the extraocular muscles of the eyes, and the lateral rectus is supplied by the fourth nerve, and the superior oblique is supplied by the lateral rectus is supplied by the sixth nerve, the superior oblique is supplied by the fourth nerve, and the rest of the extraocular muscles are all supplied by the third nerve. So what our aim is when we are doing a physical examination is to arrive at a topographical diagnosis. So for that, one of the major sources of input to the brainstem is vestibular labyrinth, but nonetheless the visual input is also very important, and so are the proprioceptors in our extremities. All this information is collected in the brainstem, and it is further modulated and transmitted to the cortex. The cerebellum plays the role of a modulator, causing literally an inhibition of excess excitement happening in the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem. So, like Dr. Prahlada said, when does the examination of the patient begin? Well, it does begin the moment you enter the consultation room, or your patient enters the consultation room, or you are going to the ward or the emergency room to see your patient. Now, look at this patient here. You can see that she is falling. She tries to walk, she tends to fall. She has to be literally held. Now, a patient with a peripheral vestibular disorder, by and large, would be able to manage to walk on his own, while a patient with a central disorder will have much more difficulty walking on his or her own and will have to be probably supported by others. Now, if you go to the emergency room, your patient is in the bed and he is not in a position to stand up. Even then, you can get a fairly good idea. You ask your patient to cross his arms across his chest and sit up in the bed. And now you look for truncal ataxia. Does the patient tend to fall? And if so, then you are dealing most likely with a central disorder. Now, coming to the Romberg or the standing test. Basically, Romberg test is mainly to evaluate a static imbalance in the vertical semicircular canals. And it is not only meant for the vestibular system, but if you are doing a Romberg test with the eyes open, the patient is getting the visual cues, the vestibular cues, and also from the proprioceptive receptors.
Avinash sir? Avinash sir, we lost your voice. Hello? Hello? Avinash sir? Dr. Pawan? Dr. Pawan?
Yeah, I'm trying to call him.
Yeah, call him. Yeah.
It looks like he has lost the connection.
Okay.
Come back.
Okay.
Come
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you are
yeah,
there,
okay.
sir.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And sir,
Unfortunately,
please be close to the mic. A lot of people are saying they are not getting the full voice.
sir, is
Yeah.
it better now?
Yeah, it's very
Is it
good.
better now?
Very good now. Very good.
Is it better now?
Better.
Is it better? Yeah. I
Go
think
ahead.
I'll have to share this. Yeah, I'll have to share the screen once again.
Yeah,
Wait.
share it.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
30 minutes. Yeah.
Can you see my screen already? No,
Not yet.
not yet. 1 minute, sir.
Maybe let me see whether I have to make you post again. Let me see. Because you came back. Yeah, your co-host. You can share it now.
There was a temporary loss of the connection, internet connection, sir.
Okay. No problem.
You go in the down center in the down. Share the screen.
No, that I can do only. Pawan, I can do that only when.
On the monitor, in the center of the.
1 minute.
Take your time. No problem. Take your time.
1 minute.
Meanwhile, Prahlad sir, you can sum up what he has told in the last 2-3 slides.
Something is not getting into my brain or something, I think. Well, let me just.
Are you
Hi.
seeing the
Yeah, okay.
share screen?
Yeah, can you see what has come into the screen now from here on?
No, you still we see your video. What you can do is you don't see the control where you can share this thing. Share screen.
Yeah, I can see it, sir. I can see it.
Okay, you press that and you share the PowerPoint presentation. We don't have PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, just a moment, sir.
Yeah.
I think I'll do one thing.
Yeah.
I will reconnect. Something is not getting all right. Just a minute.
Okay, you can reconnect. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll reconnect. Just a minute, sir.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Prahlad sir.
Yeah. Pawan,
Yeah.
I was doing some other task. I didn't notice the first 2 slides.
You can direct the things to Amit Kesri and
Amit.
Dinesh.
Yeah.
And Dinesh, they can discuss the things what has been told.
Yes. 1 minute.
Unmute
I'll bring Amit.
Amit is already unmuted. No, no, it
Yeah,
is
Amit
muted.
is already unmuted. Yeah. Oh,
No,
sorry.
no, he's muted. He's muted.
Okay, okay. I'm going to unmute Amit.
And Rajendran Dinesh.
Yeah. Yeah, Amit. Yeah, okay. He's back. He's back.
Yeah, great, great. Such a good quality of slides.
Yeah. Yeah, these technical problems likely to happen.
Yeah, it's okay,
Yeah.
sir. It's okay. Yeah.
Mm.
Go ahead. From here, you can start, sir. Yeah.
Dr. Avinash, sir, again, we don't have audio.
Did he unmute himself?
Yeah, I can unmute him. He's not muted. Okay, I'm going to unmute him. Okay. Why he... Yeah, Avinash, sir, you can speak now.
Is it all right?
Yeah, it's all right now. Yeah, yeah, okay.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Please come close to the mic.
Sir, I'm very close to the laptop, in fact.
Yeah.
Okay,
now
okay.
you can.
Perfect,
I've
perfect.
come rather close to the laptop and literally speaking into the screen.
Okay, okay, we can hear you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so we'll begin again with the Rombergs. So
Yes.
basically, it's a measure of the static imbalance in the vertical semicircular canals that we are trying to look for when
Yeah.
we are trying to aim. Our aim is to look at the vestibular system. But
Yes.
nonetheless, Romberg tests one by one gives us an idea as to the visual vestibular as well as the proprioceptive cues, whether they are in shape or not. So first we begin with the patient standing on the ground, shoes off, and with the arms outstretched. Next, ask him to close his eyes. Third step, the patient stands in the tandem position. This is also known as the sharpened Rombergs. Next, if the patient is in a position, ask him to stand on one leg, and if somebody can stand for a few seconds in this position also, there is no probability that this patient is suffering from any vestibular pathology, or for that matter, even a proprioceptive pathology. Now we want to remove the proprioceptive cues also. Eyes closed, patient stands on a piece of foam. And if somebody can stand on a piece of foam with one leg, with the eyes closed, I think nothing like it. That patient is perfect, fit and fine as far as his vestibular system is concerned. Now coming to the next test, it is the Unterberger's test. No, sorry, not the Unterberger's. I'm showing you now a patient in which I'm doing a Romberg's test, and you can say that this patient is not literally swaying into one direction. Can have a look again at it. She is in fact going back and forth and also sideways at times. She is definitely a case of central disorder, because in a peripheral disorder, in the most sharpened Romberg also, the patient would tend to fall onto one side, that is the side of the lesion. Now coming to Unterberger's or the Fukuda stepping test. Now when you're doing the Unterberger test, you are trying to look at the imbalance in the input of the lateral semicircular canal. You ask the patient to stand at one point and start marching for about 20 to 30 seconds. First with the eyes open and then with the eyes closed. Now here I'll show you two cases of peripheral vestibulopathy, acute peripheral vestibular disorder. The first patient here I'm going to show you was seen to me on day 2 of his illness. And you can see how he is swaying to the left. This patient had a right beating nystagmus. Now this is a patient seen around a week to 10 days after his first attack of, after his attack of acute unilateral vestibulopathy. He tends to sway to the left, but in fact, he even tends to fall a bit to the left, as you're going to see now. Yeah, but he is much better than the patient who was seen on day 1 of his acute unilateral vestibular disorder. Now next comes the test for coordination. This test is going to test your patient's cerebellar function. This is one way to test using the finger nose test. The patient can be asked to touch not only his nose with his finger, patient can be asked to alternately touch the nose and the finger of the examiner, or you have the heel and shin test also. That is also very good test of coordination. The basis of a good physical examination in a vertigo patient is maximally dependent upon the oculomotor examination. So we are going to spend more time on the eye examination because the eyes are the show window to the balance system. So there are basically 6 eye movement systems. These are the cardinal eye movement systems. One is the fixation or the gaze holding mechanism, which helps us to hold the image of a stationary object onto the fovea with the head stationary. The vestibular, that is the vestibulo-ocular reflex. You have the angular vestibulo-ocular reflex and the transitional vestibulo-ocular reflex. The angular vestibulo-ocular reflex subserves the purpose of angular rotation, and this gets its input from the 3 semicircular canals, whereas the transitional VOR gets the input from the otolith organs, that is the utricle and the saccule. And this helps us to hold the image steady on the retina when the patient is making brief head movements. Next comes the optokinetic, which holds the image steady on the retina during sustained head movements. Saccades. These bring the image of an object of interest quickly onto the fovea. So I'll give you an example. If I'm talking to Dr. Prahlada and my attention is focused on him, and suddenly, say Dr. Pawan calls me from the other corner, my eyes will suddenly move towards Dr. Pawan. And that is where these fast eye movements help me locate Dr. Pawan. Okay, that's just an example. Now, smooth pursuit. This holds the image of a small moving target onto the fovea. Vergence. Vergence is, when the eyes are moving in opposite directions in order to bring the images of a single object at the same time onto both the fovea. So the eyes may converge or they may diverge. Now coming to examination, where we are looking for spontaneous nystagmus. Spontaneous nystagmus is that occurs without any provocation and with the patient looking in the primary position, that is looking straight ahead. So the qualities that you look for in the spontaneous nystagmus are whether it is a jerk nystagmus or a pendular nystagmus. Jerk nystagmus means that the nystagmus is having one slow phase and one fast phase. That is, the eyes slowly drift to one side, right or left, and then there is a quick phase in which the eyes move suddenly in the opposite direction in a fast manner. Or else it's pendular. Pendular nystagmus means that it doesn't have a slow or fast phase, it has 2 equal phases. Now, the next thing you have to look for in the nystagmus is the direction of the nystagmus. Horizontal, vertical, or is it a mixed horizontal and torsional, or is it just purely torsional, or you are getting a periodic alternating nystagmus, which is beating alternately to the right or the left, or periodically beating up or down. Now you have to look at the conjugacy of the nystagmus, whether it's the conjugate nystagmus or is it a disconjugate nystagmus in the 2 eyes. And now we have to look at the effect of fixation and removal of fixation. We'll come to that. There are certain provocative tests which are done to elicit a nystagmus. And these include the Valsalva maneuver, the pressure-induced test using the Hennebert's sign, or the sound-induced nystagmus, that is the Tullius phenomenon. Then you have the head shaking nystagmus, hyperventilation, and then you have positional or positioning tests. So I'll quickly differentiate between the peripheral and central varieties of nystagmus, which is known, I think, to most of us. Mixed horizontal torsional nystagmus is the hallmark of a peripheral nystagmus. In peripheral nystagmus, the quick phase beats away from the side of the lesion, and the slow phase has a constant slow phase velocity. The slow phase is constant. It does not change its velocity. And peripheral nystagmus will be increased on removal of fixation. when you put the patient in the dark, or you use Frenzel's glasses. Peripheral nystagmus follows Alexander's law, thereby meaning that if the nystagmus is right beating and you ask the patient to turn his gaze to the right, the nystagmus will increase in intensity. And lastly, peripheral nystagmus is adaptive. In due course of time, the adaptation takes place with the help of central compensatory mechanisms, and the nystagmus gradually tends to fade away in few days or a month's time. Whereas central nystagmus, it may be horizontal, it may be a pure torsional or a pure vertical. Pure torsional and pure vertical nystagmus, by the rule, they indicate a central disorder. Central nystagmus, any direction changing nystagmus is always central. It is usually poorly suppressed with fixation, and the slow phase may have an increasing or decreasing velocity. The central nystagmus can increase with gaze away from the direction of the fast phase also. And there may be a disconjugacy between the two eyes. And this is not the kind of nystagmus that gets adapted. It continues to persist. Now here, first I'll show you a video where I'm using modified Frenzel's glasses. Very easy to make. What you need to do is just go to an optician, ask for a sturdy frame, and fix 16 to 20 diopter convex lenses. And here, you can easily see the right beating nystagmus here. Now this is the patient in which at the moment you are seeing a right beating nystagmus without the use of the removal of fixation. Now you see the same patient with removal of fixation. Pupils are dilated, you can make out. Now we have made it dark for him. You can see the increase in intensity of the right beating nystagmus. Now coming to vertical varieties of nystagmus. So first we'll talk about the downbeating type. The downbeating type of nystagmus is seen in the primary position, as I said, in the straight ahead gaze of the patient. The intensity tends to increase if you ask the patient to go into an eccentric lateral gaze. This type of nystagmus is usually conjugate. Some of the causes are an Arnold-Chiari malformation in which there's a herniation of the cerebellar tonsils. It can be seen in cerebellar degeneration, particularly pertaining to the flocculus and the paraflocculus, in vertebrobasilar infarctions, multiple sclerosis, and it can be even drug-induced. The drugs which are commonly implicated are phenytoin, carbamazepine, and it can happen with lithium toxicity. Around 30 to 40% cases of downbeat nystagmus are idiopathic. So you can see this downbeat nystagmus in this video. So upbeating variety of nystagmus also occurs in the primary position. And here the intensity increases when the patient looks upwards. This is also by and large conjugate, and the usual causes are cerebellar degeneration, a brainstem or a cerebellar infarction, multiple sclerosis, and some tumors. So you can see upbeat nystagmus here. Now coming to the gaze holding capacity. So basically the neural integrator for gaze holding capacity in the horizontal plane is the nucleus prepositus hypoglossae here. Whereas for the vertical, it is the neural integrator for vertical gaze holding mechanism is the interstitial nucleus of Cajal. So here you can see a right beating nystagmus on right gaze and a left beating nystagmus on left gaze. It's in the same patient. Now, whenever you see a gaze, horizontal gaze evoked nystagmus, topographically the lesion would lie either in the pons or the rostral medulla or in the vestibulocerebellum. A vertical gaze evoked nystagmus arises from a lesion in the midbrain, particularly in the area of the interstitial nucleus of Cajal. Now, there are a couple of important things over here. You have to differentiate this gaze evoked nystagmus from the spontaneous nystagmus of vestibular origin. Now, this spontaneous nystagmus of vestibular origin is going to follow Alexander's law. That is, it is always going to beat with much more intensity in the direction of in the eccentric gaze in the direction of the fast phase. Whereas this is not going to happen with horizontal gaze evoked nystagmus. And then you have to rule out physiological endpoint nystagmus also. And physiological endpoint nystagmus and horizontal gaze evoked nystagmus, the simple way to find out is all other types of these nystagmus, they have a constant slow phase velocity. Whereas in the gaze evoked nystagmus, the slow phase velocity is decreasing gradually. In due course of time, the velocity of the slow phase in horizontal gaze evoked nystagmus tends to decrease. Now, two particular types of nystagmus I would like to tell you about. I'm sorry, I don't have videos on these, but rebound nystagmus is seen in cases of gaze evoked nystagmus. What happens is that after some time, say around 30 seconds or so, the eyes tend to move centripetally from the eccentric gaze. And now for a while, for about say 5 seconds or more, there is a nystagmus beating in the opposite direction to that of the gaze evoked nystagmus. Here one has to suspect lesions of the paraflocculus and the flocculus. Okay, and then a word about periodic alternating nystagmus. Periodic alternating nystagmus is in which the nystagmus is beating in say the left direction or the right direction for around 90 seconds. And then there is a period of rest for about 10 seconds. And then the nystagmus beats again for the next 90 seconds or more in the opposite direction. And here one has to suspect the lesions of the nodulus or the uvula. I have one beautiful video on pendular nystagmus. And this is an acquired pendular nystagmus, a horizontal component with a torsional component and also a bit of vertical component. The most common cause in young people is a multiple sclerotic lesion. Look at this, then I'll show you the VNG video also. Okay, now I'll show you the VNG video. Look at this. You can easily make out the horizontal and the torsional component. There's a bit of vertical component also.
Yeah, Dr. Avinash sir.
Yes,
we
sir.
don't see that video because to see that video, you will have to share that again.
Sir, I'll do it. I'll do it in the end.
Yeah,
we'll
okay.
keep it for the end.
Okay, okay.
Please. If I forget, please remind me.
Yeah, sure.
I'll show you this video in the end. It's a beautiful video.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we'll move ahead to a simple and quick clinical examination, and this hints plus rather is of utmost importance to us in the emergency room when we are seeing the patient for his first ever attack of acute vertigo. Okay, now this hints comprises of a few parts. That is the head impulse test, which was first described by Hamaggi and Courtois in the year 1988. Then you have to look for nystagmus. I deliberately covered up nystagmus in the very beginning because I wanted to be a little elaborate about the nystagmus part. Then comes the test for skew deviation, and this plus stands for test of hearing. Okay, and this hints plus algorithm was first published by Kata et al. In the year 2009, and they found it as a very good algorithm for quick examination in the emergency room of an acute vestibular disorder patient. So now, what is this head impulse test? This is a very simple way to assess the VOR function at the bedside, and it reflects the viability of the VOR pathway. Quickly, you can have a look at the VOR pathway. All that I want to tell you here is that as the head goes to the left, the endolymph movement in the horizontal canal is in the opposite direction. That is, this is a centripetal, this is a, yes, this is an ampulopetal movement, which is excitatory for the left horizontal, for the horizontal canal. And thereon, we'll forget about the pathway here. The eyes move to the right. And this is a very smooth transition. The velocity of the eye movement is supposed to be almost as good as the movement of the head. So if the head moves to the left at a particular velocity, the eyes have to move to the right in the same velocity or nearly the same velocity, which means that the gain of the head impulse has to be 1 in normal people. Anyway, so what is the key to a good head impulse test? First of all, the head movement has to be of a small amplitude. That is, you should not exceed 15 to 20 degrees. It should be of a high velocity and acceleration. The velocity usually used for a horizontal head impulse test is anywhere from 100 to 250 degrees per second. And the head movements have to be random. The head has to be held very firmly. By random, I mean the patient should not have a clue as to whether I'm going to move his head to the right or to the left. So do it at random. So first of all, how to do it? My nose. You can see as the head goes to the left, the eye goes to the right. As the head goes to the left, the eye goes to the right. And brisk, rapid movements. Okay, now here, as the head goes to the left and the eyes go to the right, you can see a saccade. You can see the corrective saccade. Whereas leftward movement of the eyes on rightward movement of the head is smooth. See, here you can make out a saccade. Corrective saccade again. Anything? Okay, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So it is not without pitfalls. You see the head impulse test also. Nevertheless, it's a very good test, but one has to be false positive head impulse test also. So if there's a small infarct in the region where the nerve enters the brainstem, that is the REZ zone. If you have a small infarct over there, or you have a small plaque of multiple sclerosis, even these can result with a false positive head impulse test. Or if you have an isolated labyrinthine stroke, even that will give us a positive head impulse test. So, and another situation is when the ICA infarction, that is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery infarction, affects both the peripheral and the central vestibular structures, you will get a very imperfect hints. Now, skew deviation comes to our help. If the head impulse is positive, we are thinking in terms of a peripheral. We are thinking in terms of a peripheral vestibular disorder, but in reality, it is a central disorder. But if you find skew deviation in this patient, in that situation, again, always suspect a central disorder. This is usually done by a cover-uncover test. Here you can see that there's a misalignment of the two eyes in the vertical plane. One is up and the other is down here. So basically this is more commonly, or rather 90% of the times you will see it in central disorders, but very rarely if when there's a utricle damage and a peripheral vestibular neuritis. It may be there, but then what happens is that in a peripheral situation, it goes away in due course of time. And the compensation for this is rather rapid, whereas it will be definitely persistent when it is due to the otolithic graviceptive pathways in the brainstem. And it is normally a part of the ocular tilt reaction, wherein there is a tilt to the same side, a counter rolling of the eyes to the same side, I mean that is to the affected side. And there is a skew deviation of the eyes also. The affected side is lower and the normal side is higher up. This is where you're talking in terms of a peripheral vestibular disorder. And then I'll show you in another slide when you're talking in terms of, okay. how to arrive at this topographical diagnosis. So one situation is that where there may be a unilateral peripheral deficit of the otolithic and the vertical canal inputs. And the other situation is that you have a lesion in the graviceptive brainstem pathways, anywhere from the vestibular nuclei to the interstitial nucleus of Cajal. Now this is the figure which I was mentioning. So anywhere in the lower pons medulla, or in the vestibular nerve, or in the utricle, wherever, or in the utricle and also in the vertical semicircular canals. If the lesion lies anywhere over here, the ocular tilt reaction will be ipsilateral. Whereas if it is in the upper pons or in the mesencephalon region, it will be in the opposite direction. This will be controversive. I will simply mention this is a simple test, subjective visual vertical. This also gives us a fairly good idea about the otolithic deficit. Now coming to the plus part of it, why is test of hearing also very important? Particularly remember, in the emergency room, the patient is so much disgusted and disheartened by the vertigo that he may not be able to tell you on his own that he has a hearing loss also. So if nothing else, at least a tuning fork test has to be done in each and every patient. And in general, yes, you do get fluctuating hearing loss in Meniere's disease. It helps us in recognizing repeated transient ischemic attacks. And also helps us to differentiate between an anterior inferior cerebellar artery infarction vis-a-vis a posterior inferior cerebellar artery infarction, because hearing loss is seen in ICA but not in PICA. And also happens in ischemic or inflammatory or compressive lesions of the 8th nerve. Vestibular paroxysmia is one example where there's a compression of the 8th nerve. This patient, besides presenting with recurrent small episodes of vertigo, will also have either a permanent or a recurrent hearing loss. Now coming to another test of value, the high frequency head shake, which is based on the velocity storage mechanism. What you do here is you shake the head of the patient in the horizontal direction for about 20 times rather rapidly, and then look for appearance of nystagmus. Now here you can see the video part. Can you see? I hope you can appreciate a right beating nystagmus here. See, the importance of high frequency head shake lies in, one, when you're dealing with the peripheral vestibular disorder and it is acute. In the acute situation, high frequency head shaking leads to an increase in the intensity and velocity of the nystagmus. And if you're seeing a patient of vestibular neuritis a few weeks later or a few months later, and rather few months later, there would be no nystagmus seen in most of the cases. So it helps us make a diagnosis in retrospection. You do a high frequency head shake, and if you get a unidirectional nystagmus, we get a fairly good idea. Now, I've already covered the importance in vestibular neuritis, but you can get a high frequency head shake nystagmus in acoustic neuroma and some cases of Meniere's disease also. BPPV also, it has been reported, but the pathogenesis is absolutely unclear. So as I said, it's practically because of a deficiency in the velocity storage mechanism. Of course, lots of other theories have also been given. One point about perverted nystagmus. So if you do a horizontal head shake and you get a vertical nystagmus, always think in terms of a central lesion, and this points towards the cerebellum. Now coming to smooth pursuit mechanism. So as I said in the beginning, in the first few slides, slow eye movements which serve to stabilize the image of small moving objects on the fovea are smooth pursuit eye movements. Now the neural substrate for these smooth pursuit eye movements lies in the visual cortex, the parietal and frontal cortical areas, cerebellum, and pons. A normal smooth pursuit gain ideally should be 1 again, because that is a eye velocity divided by target velocity. But in old people, don't expect a good smooth pursuit movement. it can be less, and anywhere according to the literature above 0.38 is considered normal. And in the age group of 18 to 43, anywhere above 0.8 is considered normal at a velocity of 0.2 degrees per second. Now, you don't necessarily need sophisticated VNG equipment for that. All you can do is hold your finger in front of the patient at a distance of about 1 meter from his eyes and move the finger slowly from left to right and look at the smooth movement of the eyes of the patient. And when the smooth pursuit will be defective, the problem will be seen as a cogwheel deformity or a saccadic smooth pursuit. So when you see smooth pursuit deficit, you think in terms of a cortical defect, a defect in the pons, and the cerebellar regions that could be affected are the fastigial oculomotor region. This will give rise to a bad saccadic pursuit or a saccadic smooth pursuit in the on the controversive side. Whereas if the defect lies in the oculomotor vermis, the defect will be ipsiversive. Now, another good test which is actually dependent on the smooth pursuit is visual fixation suppression of the vestibulo-ocular reflex. This is nothing but what you tell your patient to do is to hold an object in front of his eyes and keep his eyes focused on the object and move his head from side to side. In a normal person, the eyes will keep focused on the object and the eyes will not move in the opposite direction as happens with a VOR when you move the head in the opposite direction. The other way is to ask him to hold a tongue depressor in his eyes and keep his eyes focused on the tongue depressor. There's a particular situation where the VOR cancellation is normal, but you get an impaired smooth pursuit in this patient. This is indicative of a hypofunctioning vestibulo-ocular reflex wherein the damage may be anywhere in the brainstem. Corrective saccades indicate a disturbed visual fixation suppression of the VOR, and it is always indicative of a cerebellar lesion. Now coming to saccades. Saccades are fast conjugate eye movements which bring the image of the peripheral object onto the fovea. There are two types of saccades. One is reflexive saccades. These are visually guided and triggered by the appearance of a peripheral visual object. The other type of saccades are memory guided. These are carried out to a target location where the target has been previously located. Like I know where my spectacles are kept, and from my memory, I will look at my spectacles. There is no provocation that I have to look in that direction, but it is memory guided. Whereas when it comes to reflexive saccades, I gave you the example in the very one beginning. If I'm looking at one person and I get a call from the other person, or I get an object of interest suddenly in the other direction, the eyes suddenly move in a fast manner in that direction. Now to check for saccades, again a very simple thing. Keep your fingers of both the hands or any two objects at a distance of about 1 meter and ask the patient to alternatively look left and right. You can even give the instructions to the patient, left, right, and then that also helps you. Now, the saccade generator, the burst neurons, they lie for the vertical saccades in the rostral interstitial nucleus of the in the MLF, whereas for the horizontal saccade generation, the burst neurons are present in the parapontine reticular formation, that is the PPRF. See, why I'm showing all these diagrams is also because you should know what is the importance of doing these tests, and if you get an abnormal result, what does it mean? So this is what it means. So when you get a saccadic palsy, that is, you get slow saccades. If you get a conjugate in the horizontal plane, if you get a conjugate palsy, slow saccades, the lesion is indicating, the problem is indicated towards the pons. Whereas in the vertical direction, if you are getting a problem in the saccades, then it indicates a rostral midbrain lesion. There's a particular condition where you get unilateral adduction palsy, and that is what we call internuclear ophthalmoplegia. So I'll show you internuclear ophthalmoplegia through this diagram. So what is happening is that this is the abducens nucleus, that is the sixth nerve nucleus, and there is a crossover over here, and this is going to supply the oculomotor nucleus over here. The oculomotor neurons, they travel to the oculomotor nucleus. Now what happens is that, and there is a direct connection from the abducens nucleus to the lateral rectus muscle of the same side. Okay, so now if the patient is looking straight ahead, it is normal. You ask the patient to look to the right side, there is good enough abduction to the right side. You ask the patient to look to the left, the left eye abducts perfectly all right, because the lateral rectus of the left is normal, but the medial rectus muscle of the right eye has been now affected. So there will be no ability of the right eye to adduct. And vergence is not affected, because vergence, you ask the patient to cross the eyes, that is convergence. Vergence is not affected because there is a different nerve supply to the for vergence, so that doesn't get affected. Now, if you get dysmetric saccades, dysmetria means either the person tends to overshoot or undershoot. Undershoot is very common. That is, hypometric saccades are very common. And normally the problem lies in the dorsal vermis. Coming to hypometric saccades. Now here the localization of the lesion is towards the posterior fastigial nucleus. And if you have a delayed initiation of saccades, that is, the patient takes a long time to begin the saccade, then it indicates a cortical lesion. Now there's another proactive test, that is a test of hyperventilation, wherein the patient is asked to take alternative deep breaths, inhale and exhale rapidly for about 60 to 90 seconds. In old people, be careful, I don't ask them to do it for more than 40 seconds or so. And now this is based on the fact that a hypocapnia and alkalosis results in improved conduction in the damaged nerve. If you get dizziness in the patient on hyperventilation, but you don't get nystagmus, now you're dealing with a patient who is hyper anxious, or you're dealing with a patient of psychogenic dizziness. The common circumstances where you can get a hyperventilation induced nystagmus are vestibular paroxysmia, that is a microvascular compression of the 8th nerve, in small acoustic neuromas, and it's also seen in patient of vestibular neuritis. You see in old case of vestibular neuritis where compensation has occurred, but when you do a hyperventilation test, you will get a nystagmus here also. Now, in the beginning, I mentioned that there are some provocative tests to elicit the nystagmus. Now, these include the Valsalva. There are two types of Valsalva. One is the glottic Valsalva, wherein you ask the patient to squat as if he was squatting on an Indian-style toilet, and the other is against blowing the cheeks against a closed nostril. Now, I'm not going into too much of detail because I think as ENTs, we have all read about it in the books also. So basically, when it comes to problems related to the ear, you are basically looking at a third window. So the superior semicircular canal dehiscence, it also seen in stapes subluxation, may happen with vestibular fibrosis, and of course perilene fistula. You can find a pressure-induced nystagmus even in Arnold-Chiari malformation, and there are some other cardiovascular causes also. Then coming to Henneberg sign or the fistula test, where you can apply pressure over the tragus and you will get a nystagmus, or the pneumatic otoscope can be used, or even the tympanometer can be used to do it. Now moving on to positional and positioning nystagmus tests. The other day, there was a discussion about the difference between positional and positioning nystagmus tests. Positional nystagmus is something that is static. The moment you put a patient's head in a particular position, you get that nystagmus, and that nystagmus continues to remain there as long as the head is in the new position. And in contrast to this, positioning nystagmus is seen when you put the head in a new position. It stays there for some time, but it decays if the position is maintained there for a prolonged period. So the nystagmus that you get in BPPV is a positioning variety, whereas positional nystagmus now benign paroxysmal positional vertigo. Again, I'm not going to talk on BPPV much. We know that it's the most common diagnosed vestibular disorder, and the posterior semicircular canal is most often affected, followed by the lateral canal, and anterior semicircular canal is rather rarely involved. You get short spells of severe vertigo, and you see the nystagmus also. In the posterior canal, it's a upbeating torsional nystagmus, and if the upper pole is beating to the right, it is a right-sided Dix-Hallpike, and if it's beating to the left, you're doing a left-sided test. Should I play it again? Oh, I think you've seen it already. This video I'll show you again at the end, the lateral canal, because I know if I had to actually hyperlink it, because if I was copying and pasting it over here, the video quality was going bad. So I'll show this one to you in the end, and the other one also in the end. Now, if you get a patient where the history is suggestive of BPPV and you do a positional test, you don't get any nystagmus, you don't get any vertigo. So either the patient is there's been a fatigue of the nystagmus and the vertigo. We know it's one of the cardinal features of BPPV, or the patient has gone into spontaneous remission before coming to you, although the history is very typical. The third possibility should never be ignored. That is, we are dealing with another etiology, and therefore we have to investigate this patient further. Now you've done a positional test. You get vertigo in the position in the provocative position, but you do not get any nystagmus. Go ahead with the liberatory maneuver, and if it results in resolution, I think our job is done, and we were dealing with the patient of subjective BPPV. But on the other hand, you don't get nystagmus, but you get vertigo. You've done the liberatory maneuver. You do not get any resolution of the problem of the vertigo. Must investigate further, must think in terms of another etiology. Now, these are the few points I have collected, and part of them are from my personal experience also. Should never go exclusively by what the patient has to tell you. A patient of BPPV may not be able to tell you that he gets the vertigo only in the provocative posture. He only gets it for a few seconds or a minute. Because if it is the first ever time he has got it, for him, all world has fallen on him, and he says he's dizzy all the time. So don't go by it. Perform positional tests in all the patients who present to you, whether it's a first time or it is recurrent vertigo. And another point is that you're doing a Dix-Hallpike test, but you get a horizontal nystagmus. It's very well known that the horizontal nystagmus of a lateral canal BPPV can present when you're doing a Dix-Hallpike test. So don't think it's a posterior canal you're dealing with. Don't look at the position that you're putting the patient in. It is the nystagmus, the pattern of nystagmus, the type of nystagmus that you get, which dictates the canal that is involved. Also, a central vestibular lesion involving the vestibular nuclei or the caudal cerebellum. This can mimic a nystagmus that you get on doing a McLeod-Pagnini test in a lateral canal. in a suspected lateral canal BPPV, be aware of it. This will be a positional type of nystagmus which will persist as long as the head is in that particular provocative position. Whereas, however long it may take, horizontal canal BPPV nystagmus has to fade away. And always assess any downbeating positional nystagmus neurologically and think of imaging, because anterior canal BPPV is very, very rare. Unless in a rare instance, you are getting a typical nystagmus in the head hanging posture and you have done the Iacoviano maneuver for that patient and the patient has become perfectly all right, then in those rare circumstances, you can do away with assessing further. Another important diagnosis, again, a very common disorder, that is vestibular migraine, can also present as positional vertigo. And here the nystagmus pattern will be that of a central variety. The nystagmus will again be non-fatigable. It could be a direction changing nystagmus and it will never correspond to the canal being tested. Now, I'm almost towards the end of the lecture. Cardiac arrhythmias are also a cause for dizziness or imbalance or even spinning vertigo. Now, blood pressure is very important. There are some patients who will come to you with a complaint that if they stand up suddenly from a sitting position, or they are first getting out of the bed in the morning, so the moment they tend to stand, they feel very dizzy. Sometimes there is a dimming of vision also associated with it, sometimes not. Sometimes they complain of rotatory vertigo, sometimes it's dizziness. So we don't have to be misled by that. If there is such a complaint from the patient in the history, you have to think in terms of orthostatic hypotension, particularly so in patients who have been taking antihypertensives. Now, it's a very simple thing. Ask the patient to lie down for a few minutes, take the blood pressure, then ask the patient to stand up and take 3 recordings of blood pressure again. And if you get a difference of 20 mm of Hg in the systolic blood pressure, think in terms of orthostatic hypotension. Now, in the brainstem, it is not just the vestibular nuclei. You have nuclei of so many other nerves in the vicinity. And by and large, if there is a brainstem lesion, it will not involve only, unless it's a very small lesion, it will not involve only the 8th nerve, but you will also have other nerves affected. So you have to look at the speech of the patient, whether there is dysarthria or not. You have to look for whether the patient is having a proper swallowing mechanism or not. And here this pertains to the 9th and 10th nerves. You should check for the facial sensation. The 5th nerve is also in the vicinity. 7th nerve travels along with the 8th nerve. So you should look for a facial paralysis or a palsy. Then another test one should do to look for vertebrobasilar insufficiency is the vertebral artery testing. Although rarely so, because there's a lot of collaterals available, but then it's a very simple test which I usually do before I do a Dick-Solpike maneuver on a patient of BPPV, lest I fall into some trouble. So, although rare, the common causes would be a vessel impingement due to osteophytes or some tendinous insertions. Then you should also look for the reflexes. And what happens is that you might get hyperreflexia in terms when you're dealing with the pyramidal tract disease, and you may get absent or hyporeflexia, absent reflexes or hyporeflexia in peripheral nerve disorder. Then you can do a pinprick test also to check for sensation, or you can keep a tuning fork on the shin of the patient's leg, and this is to look for long track signs. So the thumb rule is that peripheral vestibular disorders, they cause abnormal VOR and they spare literally everything else. They spare all other eye movements like saccades, etc. Whereas central disorders can cause abnormal pursuit, abnormal VOR suppression, abnormal saccades with or without VOR problems. So the take home message is, well, you may own a VNG, a VHIT, VEMS, ECOG, anything, but your clinical acumen, they are the first and foremost. So hone your clinical skills. They're really going to go a long way to help your patients. Thank you very much. Stay safe. And now I'm going to show
Avinash, you can show the videos.
Yes, sir. I'm going to the videos. Yes, I'm going to the videos.
You have to, when you open the window, again you go to new share and share the video. Okay.
Sure, sir.
Yeah.